So we're continuing this theme of the Sermon on the Mount. And we're getting to the difficult patches. So Matt and I, we tossed a coin for who gets murder and who gets adultery. No, I'm kidding. That's not how it happened. Obviously, it's more organised than that. But yes, so they've got the Sermon on the Mount, which, as you have heard many times, is a section of teaching from Jesus on how people should live a good life. It takes place on this mountaintop, and it may actually take place on a mountaintop, but it could also be symbolic, because throughout the whole of the Old Testament, we have this story that on the mountaintop, that's a place where you can meet God, where God is really close to the earth. So you see Moses going to the top of Mount Sinai to meet God powerfully and bringing down the 10 Commandments. And in many ways, that's kind of a bit like what Jesus is doing now. And you also see other prophets like Elijah having their share of mountaintop experiences, like on Mount Carmel. So the mountain is a good place to be, because what Jesus is doing here is he's imagining a place where God meets the people, where heaven touches earth, and where we imagine what world should be like in the renewed creation when heaven happens on earth. And I guess that's what Jesus is really trying to get us to imagine, what it would really be like. What would the kingdom of heaven be like on the earth? So we come to this section. We've had the Beatitudes and the Salt and Light. We come to this section called the extensions. So not quite like an extension cable, but perhaps like taking the lid off something and seeing more space. So like this nice man you can see at the end of this box. Jesus takes rules which I think are quite easy to follow and makes them a lot more difficult. So the first one that we're looking at today is murder. And they're very clear. Accidentally hitting someone with your car doesn't count. It has to be intentional murder. And I looked at that and thought, that's one I definitely don't need to worry about because I haven't intentionally killed anyone. But then, as we see later in Paul, one of the things that Jesus is doing with these extensions is saying it's not enough to just live by the very edge of the words. You also need to live by the Spirit. So not killing people isn't enough. You need to do more than the bare minimum of not doing the crime. You need to try and live according to the spirit of the word, which will lead you to being more fruitful. So let's see what Jesus says about murder, which sometimes I find quite troubling when I hear it.
You have heard that it was said to the people long ago, "You shall not murder, and anyone who murders will be subject to judgment." But I tell you that anyone who is angry with a brother or sister will be subject to judgment. Again, anyone who says to a brother or sister, "Raka," is answerable to the court. And anyone who says, "You fool," will be in danger of the fire of hell. Therefore, if you are offering your gift at the altar, and there remember that your brother or sister has something against you, leave your gift there in front of the altar. First, go and be reconciled to them, then come and offer your gift. Settle matters quickly with your adversary who is taking you to court. Do it while you are still together on the way, or your adversary may hand you over to the judge, and the judge may hand you over to the officer, and you may be thrown into prison. Truly, I tell you, you will not get out until you have paid the last penny.
So that's a passage which is actually really nice, the way that they frame it on the Lumo clip, isn't it, with the two kids fighting, because it kind of gives you an insight of how it might have been. But in this one, there's quite a lot of scary talk about judgment. So we're just going to spend a tiny second unpacking that, but that's not the important part of this. So the assumption back in the day in Jerusalem is that if you commit murder, that will be punished by death. That's not how things happen now, because obviously we don't have the death penalty now. And that might have been the punishment on the books back in the day. But we can think in the Bible there are lots of people who committed murder, who God worked with and redeemed and made into fruitful disciples rather than killing off. So we've got Cain, who kills his brother Abel right at the start of Genesis. God didn't kill him, even though there wasn't really any excuse for Cain's behaviour. He protected him from everyone else, really. Or we've got Moses, who killed an Egyptian soldier who was exiled, but actually didn't get killed either. He got liberated the people of Israel. Or King David, who really unacceptedly killed the husband of the woman he was having an affair with so he could marry her himself. That's really bad murder in many ways. God didn't kill him. He walked with him and changed him. So when we read these passages which talk about judgment, we do need to remember them in the context of the whole Bible, where God is fundamentally in the transformation business. God takes people at their lowest ebb and makes them into people that God works through. Even people who've fallen as far as Cain or King David. So when we fall short and get angry and say things like, "You fool," which I'm sure all of us have, certainly I have, we need to remember that God's view is much longer than ours, that it's never too late to be filled with love and become who God is calling us to be. And that's partly because we're all made in God's image. So if we went around punishing people by killing them for doing bad things to other people, then we would also be guilty of something profound. Instead, as a society, we need to think about how can we make the image of God in other people come alive? How can we make their light shine brighter? How can we make them into the people that God knows that they can be when God takes the long view? So God takes this commandment against murder and extends it to anger, to even saying that if someone's a fool. Now, as I was saying, I've definitely done that. I'm sure most of you have called someone a fool at some point. Is there anyone here who's never called anyone a fool? It's quite archaic language, so I guess the younger people maybe? No, you've used fool as well. But the truth is, when you get really angry, it can consume all of you. It can take up all of your head, because all you're thinking about is, I'm really angry. And that affects the way you relate to other people. It affects the way you are. It affects the way you relate to God. And I think sometimes we all have to work at avoiding that, because sometimes even when we're right to be angry, the only person that anger hurts when it takes over our lives is us. So Kathy remembers visiting someone who came through the pathway system and they got housing and they'd been through some awful stuff. And they were right to be angry with it because it has been terrible. But when she visited, their entire dining room was completely covered in legal papers about their court hearing, because all they could think about was punishing the person who had hurt them. And there was no dinner table for that lady to eat dinner with her kids. And that's because symbolically her whole home, her whole life was taken up with the anger. And the person that was hurting was her. And that's how symbolic of how anger can be. You can be right to be angry, but if you give it too much space, it can take up all of your life and prevent you from having good connections with other people. Like this lady didn't have a dining table and space to connect to her family. Now we're just going to touch on the scary bit about hell or Gehenna and the burning in this section, because it's quite a scary image and it's not the one I want you to take away from this. The word translated as hell here, or fires of hell, is Gehenna, which isn't a picture of a future damnation, but it was actually a real place in Jesus' place. It was basically a big dump where they burnt the rubbish outside the walls of Jerusalem, called the fires of Gehenna. So in terms of murder, that teaching seems to be that having so much hatred, letting it take up so much of your mind like that lady did, will leave us on the outside of the community looking in. It means that you kind of ostracize yourself. You make a hell of your own making, and you end up living on the outside looking in because you've given that thought too much space in your life. But the good news is that Jesus' constant call is invitation to leave these things behind. You can always drop your fear, your anger, your hatred with God and come and follow him. So this dump outside the walls is not somewhere that's a permanent destination, but a picture of what Jesus has come to help us avoid. However, while this teaching as a whole seems to be extending to the idea that, words as well as actions, it is worth remembering that it's not just yourself you can hurt when you hate people and you say cruel words. Especially nowadays in the age of the internet, where people can type things behind a keyboard and not deal with the consequences. I think everybody in this room probably has some words that they carry with them that someone really nasty has said to them that are under their skin, that are going to affect the way they see themselves and the way they see other people as well. So sometimes when you act in anger, you act in hatred, you can put other people in a bit of a place of hell on earth. And those words, they don't go away. They don't kill you, but they do sit there undercutting the way you see God's image in yourself, the way you see your light in yourself, just like Matt was saying last week. So words matter. Name calling, even calling someone a fool matters, because you're never going to see the cost of how that lives with that person. And it can be awful. So when you think about what it means to be part of the ideal society, the kingdom of heaven on earth, then we need to prevent anger, even though anger is sometimes the only way that people make things right. We don't need to prevent that, but we need to ensure that anger doesn't completely consume people. We need to work out making connections with people so they aren't just fighting their lonely battles against unjust systems on their own. We need to work out how to help people who are angry so they aren't all angry all the time, so they have time to be a human being, to reach out, to meet other people. We need to work out basically how to prevent hell on earth, whether that means through preventing people being consumed by anger or preventing people from being hurt and destroyed by other people's cruelty. And I think throughout all of this, one of the things that Jesus is doing is he's showing us how to live in the spirit of this law so that you can really be free. And Jewish scholars call this drawing a fence around the law. And that's because just like a fence protects your house and garden, the extensions that Jesus is putting, like try not to be angry, anger has consequences. You might end up living in hell on earth, or you might make a hell on earth for someone else, is something that protects the core of it because it helps people from doing things that will end up struggling to come back from, like actually killing someone or isolating themselves and living in hell on earth. So there's this protective fence to stop you from ending up there. Because ultimately, God's longing is to break the chains and to set all kinds of people free. And even if you do that terrible thing, even if you kill someone like Cain or King David, we see that God works with and transforms all kinds of lives. But it is better if you spend more of your earthly life being free rather than in chains. So God's extensions in this kind are kind of trying to help us break those chains so that we're less likely to end up at that low ebb where we really need God to rescue us. All of us fall, and all of us end up there sometimes, and God is always there to pick us up. But the dream is that we are free to live with God in a way that is really beautiful and satisfying. That's what God wants. That's part of the vision of heaven on earth. Amen.